go. Hello everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar around apprenticeships, what employers need to know for the new academic year. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Rachel Roby, who's going to be taking you through today's presentation. Rachel is Strategic Apprenticeship Lead at Cogent Skills, and I'm well versed in all matters regarding apprenticeships. And just some house rules before we get cracking really. This sort of cameras are turned off at the moment, and lines are on mute. The webinar session is being recorded, and a copy of that recording will be made available after the session. If you've got any questions as Rachel goes through the presentation, please fire them through in the chat box, which you should be able to see in the corner of your screen, and we'll sort of get through to those probably at the end of the session. It's billed as about a 45-minute session in total. And so we'll sort of just without further ado hand over to yourself, Rachel, if that's okay.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you everybody for taking time during your busy lunch to join us today. So yeah, today is the third of an annual update that I provide about updated funding rules. So as those that may know or not, the ESFA, which manage the funding for apprenticeships, update their funding rules at the start of every academic year. So this is a 45-minute session just for the key messages that you should know about and key changes and what potential implications they have for you, your training providers and your individual learners. So brief introductions. About Cogent, we are one of the original sector skills councils. We are here to support the science and technology sector, and within Cogent we have a number of different business units. We have an apprenticeship training company and support recruiting graduates, and we're also a flexi job apprenticeship agency. We have an endpoint assessment organisation who are SIAS. We have two membership arms, which is the Science Industry Partnership and the Nuclear Skills Strategy Group. And then we also have a courses and consultancies arm. I'm here representing Cogent. I'm Rachel Roby. I'm the Strategic Apprenticeship Lead, and I support on all things technical education. So it's helping employers and stakeholders understand the real life implications of technical education policy. A big part of my role is supporting employers updating Trailblazer standards, and I'm also involved in lots of other employer-centric groups within DFE. So without further ado, so we have some fundamental structural changes to the funding rules this year. First of all, it was really good to see that the version 1 rules were released an awful lot earlier than they have in the past couple of years. So the first set of rules were published 4 months before the start of the academic year, which will fall on the 1st of August, which is really good. It gives all parties time to digest the rules, make the changes that they need to on all their documentation, and be ready for the start of the academic year. The rules have been consolidated into one document. Previous years they've been 3 separate documents, but now there is one. They have taken a view of removing unnecessary rules. There was lots of duplication, and they have tried, and I think quite successfully, simplified some of the language throughout the documents. And what they've also done is, at the end of each section, they have included a box which is specific for training providers and employers to understand what evidence might be needed to be able to fulfil the funding rules, which again is a good thing to bring in. Key takeouts, so there hasn't been a significant amount of changes this year. Every year has a range of changes, but I think after the last couple of years where we've seen a lot of change and a lot of policy change, they've given providers a bit of a year off. There are still changes to digest and they will still have implications, but a lot of it is kind of tweaking the policy rather than implementing brand new ones. So there is some increased flexibility for employers. This includes allowing virtual progress reviews, although they have been being done in previous years, allowing a bit of time for signatures on training plans, and also not mandating attendance at key discussions, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. There is some timing changes for active learning and break of learning administration, moving to a calendar month rather than 28 days. Quite a big change if you've only got any part-time apprentices or 0 hours contracted apprentices. As you may or may not know, part-time apprentices are expected to extend their standard length of stay so that they aren't at a disadvantage of meeting their off-the-job hours. There is now a rule that as long as they've met the 12-month requirement and they've covered all of the off-the-job, they can go through to Gateway quicker, which again is something that you can internally talk about with your providers. Really strong emphasis still on the training plans and making sure that training plans are really robust. There is some additional funding coming in for care leavers. There's a bursary now that will increase to £3,000. So if you know that you do have care leavers that are joining you and starting apprenticeships, it will be the training provider's responsibility to claim for that funding, and then that will be paid directly to the apprentice. And then this set of funding rules, what I would say should, and I'll put the emphasis on should, they should be easier to implement, which means I know that there was quite a delay in some providers being able to get starts on the system and on the digital account service, the DAS, because of the nature of the changes over the last couple of years. I would hope this set of changes, there won't be as much of a delay, because I'm hoping that there won't be that much that they have to change. We're going to put a link to the funding rules in the chat so you have a full copy of them, and then the next few slides I'll just talk you through the key changes in key themes, and then some pros and cons and some things for you to all consider and maybe take back and start to talk to your providers about, start talking to your apprentices about, or just internally having discussions with manager mentors of apprentices internally. But also if you are about to start your onboarding for your maybe summer starts or your September cohort starts, it's something for you to be on the front foot about, and conversations that providers may be having with you. So support for English and maths. Obviously English and maths and functional skills is a mandatory part of an apprenticeship. They are tightening some of the rules around, or adding clarity as to what level of English and maths should be achieved. So for anybody that's on a level 2 programme, they must achieve their level 1 in maths and English, unless that they have being initially assessed at a level 2 where they need to achieve their level 2. But when a learner has achieved their level 1, they must show evidence that they are working towards their level 2. So for the duration of the programme, after they've achieved their level 1 functional skills, they must be making progress towards their level 2, and be making some meaningful progress. For those apprentices that are on a level 3 plus, so 4, 5, 6 or 7, and they don't have the relevant evidence to exempt them from their functional skills, they must achieve maths and English at level 2 to be able to go through to Gateway and complete their endpoint assessment. And one of the rules that is coming in now is about tuition and when functional skills delivery should start. It's been a bit of a bone of contention for many years, and training providers have been guilty of leaving functional skills delivery until further into the programme, which has then caused a delay to Gateway, but they're being asked, and it is really important that functional skills is delivered at the beginning. So again, just my kind of view on this is, to me, it's been a long time coming that training should start ASAP. It gives the learner a chance to obviously pass the level that they're expected to learn and potentially upskill, and also takes the pressure off at the end, and making sure there's plenty of time to achieve their functional skills, work on their endpoint assessment prep and go through to endpoint assessment. And one point just to remind you of, if you're unaware of this, is that English and maths training is not included in the 20% off the job. So in the training plan, English and maths should be planned in a separate part of the training plan and individual learning record, and those hours should not be included in the off the job training. In terms of initial assessments, so one of the changes this year that they want to bring in is a discussion between the provider, the individual and their employer about the outcomes of what the initial assessment is. So the initial assessment is a series of tests that a learner does at the beginning of their programme to identify their starting point. There will be questions that will take them through some of the key knowledge, the key skills and the behaviour aspects of what they're going to learn on the programme. And it's about identifying the true starting point of where the learner is and where the learner has to get to make occupational competence. So what they're saying is they want a formally arranged discussion, and that in that discussion, it must include a discussion around the recognition of prior learning, how an agreement on how all parties are going to work together to achieve, an agreement that the employers will attend progress review, and then through the conversations and after the recognition of prior learning, the formal costings of the apprenticeship will be discussed. And this is an extension of a rule that came in over the last couple of years around an apprenticeship funding will only fund new learning. So if an apprentice has recognised prior learning, so basically if they're not scoring themselves 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10 on their initial assessments, there is a chance that they already have some prior experience, which means that they wouldn't be fully fundable at the full cost of the funding band. So the provider and providers up and down the land have done a lot of work over the last couple of years to work out what modules cost to deliver. So if they have to remove modules or if there isn't funding available for certain aspects because the learner already has the evidence, then they have to renegotiate the costs of that and offer and show you the pricing and how the pricing is going to be made. So these all have to happen in a discussion. If the employer can't attend the discussion, the provider must allow time to contribute, and then that has to be signed and signatures need to be included, and that is part of the evidence that needs to go in the evidence pack that is the training provider's responsibility to gather. There are some pros and cons of this. So in terms of the pros, there is some flexibilities to allow employers to give feedback, but it is really important that you as employers do engage, or if your training provider's on the call, that you are really encouraging and you're explaining why employers need to get involved in these early stages. The paramount importance of planning an apprenticeship will be the basis of the success of it moving forward. If all parties aren't on board, if there's concern, if there's worries, if there's uncertainties around how things are going to be trained, it leads to more confusion later down the line, which can then disengage learners, can disengage employers, and that's where we can get to non-achiever leavers because people want to give up. And also that commitment to join the progress review. A progress review is 4 times a year, it's every 12 weeks. It isn't an awful lot of time to take out of your quarter to have some reflective time with the apprentice on how they're getting on. So it is really important that either you as L&D professionals who maybe are allocating mentors to apprentices, or you are specifically a mentor or will be responsible for conducting and getting involved in progress reviews, that you do book these in and you do make sure that you are available. Costing is obviously quite a sensitive subject, but it's really important that there is a constructive dialogue for costing. And I suppose what I would say around the con, because you don't have to mandatory attend, there is a risk that training providers could kind of steamroll through and do the training plan, sign it off, and you not to be involved. And it's really important that you are involved. Please don't allow the system to be abused. Flexibilities are allowed because ESFA recognise how busy employers are, but that shouldn't be abused by training providers taking control and taking over and just kind of steamrolling through tailoring training plans. You need to make sure that you're bought in and you understand what's happening. In terms of apprenticeship agreement, so this is the documentation that is signed at the beginning of the apprenticeship, and what they're bringing in is making sure that there is enough allocation to include endpoint assessment. Endpoint assessment is on average 3 to 6 months at the end of the learning period. So what they're asking and what they're making sure is that you, when you are taking apprentices on within your contracts of employment, you are making sure that endpoint assessment timeframes are included. And this is because there's been scenarios where somebody might have been taken on for 12 months. The apprenticeship is 12 months, but the endpoint assessment is 3 months. Therefore, there should be a 15-month employment timeframe offered. And this is just to make sure that apprentices will have enough time to do all of their delivery and participate in endpoint assessment under the same employer. There's also a rule which I'm sure isn't applicable, but I wanted to include it, that the individual signing the agreement cannot be the apprentice and the employer. This sometimes happens in micro businesses, but there needs to be an identifiable line manager. And what I would say is if the apprenticeship agreement isn't complete and it isn't signed, the individual is invalid and therefore isn't eligible for funding. It is a legal requirement that the apprenticeship agreement is signed. And what I've just said in here, not really pros and cons, but more of a view, that it's a really good, I think it's a good intervention to make sure the safeguards around the employment status, linking to contractual agreements, and that mandating a copy has always been kind of a rule, but it's good that it's kind of being added in, and it strengthens that compliance perspective. And when I talk about compliance, that is because every training provider is eligible for ESFA audits. And when an audit happens, they have a pack of evidence that they must be able to present to the auditors. And one of the first things they look at is for signatures on the apprenticeship agreement. It's normally one of the first pieces of paper in the pack. So again, it's just to make sure that compliance is adhered to at all times. Apprenticeship wages, minimum duration and employment hours. So we must ensure that apprentices are paid a lawful wage for the time that they spend at work and off the job training, and it is the employer's responsibility to pay the minimum national minimum wage. If they don't pay minimum wage, then the individual is ineligible for funding, and providers are now being asked to confirm that the apprentice wage is lawful. So this may mean that they'll start to ask to see employment contracts and agreements on salary and how salary is being paid or how hours are being paid. So it's just a piece of evidence that they'll ask. They may want to take a copy of it and they will keep it, but it is now being added into the rules around seeing sight of salary. And like I said at the beginning of the session, anybody that's on a part-time contract can complete their apprenticeship early now, as long as they have met the minimum duration, which is a 12-month legal requirement, and that all the off-the-job hours have been met and have been evidenced. I think I've got a few concerns about this in terms of part-time hours and fast-tracking apprenticeships. It can be a good thing, but what I would say in terms of from a learner perspective is that they shouldn't feel rushed through the process. Bearing in mind, if they're only in work for half the time as a full-time employee, they're only having the opportunity to do half the off the job and half the time to learn the job. So, you know, in terms of making sure that they're learning everything, that they're fully meeting the KSBs of the standards, but also that they're not being pressured by anybody to get through to Gateway to achieve their apprenticeship. And obviously from your point of view as employers, it's making sure that you're giving them the full training experience that they're eligible for, that nobody's being pressured to put a learner through quicker, and making sure that the learner is fully competent against the equivalent full-time learner to be able to go through endpoint assessment. What it is good for is if somebody's on a part-time contract on day one of the programme, but they always do overtime, they end up doing additional hours, and that they are able to work their way through their apprenticeship quicker and have more opportunity for off the job. What's happened in the past is they've had to stay on programme longer, so they're not getting any new learning, they're competent, they're ready to sit endpoint assessment. So for that, it's a good thing. It just needs to be policed, I think, and made sure that part-time learners aren't missing out on key learning opportunities. Moving on to off the job, some bullet point rule changes that are coming in. I suppose key reminders really, so I won't labour the point. Exams and testing must not be included, so time allocations are not added to the off the job. Revision is now included, so where it is specifically required for the achievement of an apprenticeship, they can now add in time for off-the-job activity, which is a good. Lots of apprenticeships who have mandatory qualifications that have exams, preparing for endpoint assessment, if you're preparing to do a test, or any aspects of EPA prep, revision hours can be added into the off-the-job. Only statutory leave, which is 20 days and 8 bank holidays, are allowed to be taken off, which is 5.6 weeks every year for annual leave. If you offer more annual leave, that's absolutely fine, but only statutory will be taken off the job on an annual basis. All planned off the job must be agreed to before delivery, so before the programme starts, which is why the training plan is so important, including all of what's going to happen in the workplace. So this is why it makes it even more crucial that employers are engaged from day one, because you must be able to document where all of the workplace training of the knowledge, skills and behaviours is coming from, and those hours need to be ensured that they're recorded down. And ultimately, the provider is responsible for the delivery and monitoring of the off-the-job. So in terms of pros and cons, it's good that they're making changes to off-the-job activities. It's really good to see that they are making some tweaks and they're listening to feedback around adding in revision. What I would say around the testing element, that providers could ask for financial contributions to testing. So if some providers are more involved in testing, so maybe they invigilate, they come in and they're on site when assessment happens, they could ask for costs to do that. But also it does add more emphasis on making sure that you as an employer are involved in the planning stages to make sure that all of those off-the-job activities are recorded down. To ensure that they go into the hours to make up the overall off the job. Moving on to active learning, so I mentioned again at the beginning, so this is just a brief change. It's more of an admin change really. So rather than asking for 28 days, they're moving some things to calendar months, and that will be introduced for all apprentices, not just new ones. Which is a positive step. It just gives a little bit more flexibility in the timing of things, but also it might help with companies that have peaks. So delivery windows could be stretched out. So as an example, you might do some off the job the beginning of month 1, but you might then not have to deliver or have something formally planned until towards the end of month 2. So by giving a bigger window, especially if you have peak times, so if you have key projects that you need to make sure where you need learners on the job rather than off the job, if you also know that you might have an outage where you can't deliver, or you need to really concentrate, that you have a bit of flexibility, that you're not rigid in when you have to deliver the training. Training plans, obviously I've mentioned training plans quite a lot. It is a fundamental part, and it's probably the biggest piece of work that has to take place and be designed at the beginning of the programme. And what I would say is that adding some flexibility on when the final version can be signed off. And this was taken into consideration feedback from last year, because there were providers that were trying to get training plans signed off that couldn't start claiming funding. So there was learners enrolled on programme and actually started delivery, but their training plans hadn't been signed off, so funding hadn't commenced. So they're now allowing 42 days, which is a qualifying period. It's about 6 weeks, where it's almost a cooling off period if learners want to maybe come off programme. So it's giving a bit of extra time to be able to sign all the documents, get everything ready without falling foul of funding rules, which gives everybody a little bit more time. So again, I've just said this kind of takes pressure off that go live date, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you agree with the training plan and you agree with that from day one, so that you aren't, inadvertently negatively impacting apprentices being able to get started and get up and running with their learning. Progress reviews. So again, they're allowing some flexibility with progress reviews, and they've committed to virtual reviews allowing to take place. To be honest, virtual reviews have been taking place for a long time, especially obviously during the pandemic, but they're just writing it into the rules that it is allowed to take place virtually. They must happen at least 4 times a year. But what they are saying is you can flex when those happen if you have a valid reason. So one of the scenarios that's given is those providers that maybe work in terms or semesters. It may make more sense to plan your review at the end of a semester rather than kind of an every 12 week by the rule. It might make sense to wait until you've done an exam and got the results, which might take you over the 12 weeks. So what they're saying is if you can justify the reason to maybe move outside the scope, then that will be allowed. If employers can't attend, you must be allowed to contribute, you must be allowed to see the documentation and you must sign it. And this will be a retrospective rule, not just for new apprentices, but also for past apprentices, which I think makes sense. But again, you really need to be involved in the progress reviews. I can't stress it enough. It isn't a lot of time. It is really beneficial for an apprentice to hear your feedback, but also for you to be involved in the discussions about setting targets, about reflective practice. So it is really, really important that you do take part in them. Moving on to the final bit of sections. These are kind of quick fire bits now. Ineligible costs. So additional learning for resits will not be funded. So there are lots of changes happening with fundable qualifications within apprenticeship standards. If you are currently involved or if standards are being revised, it is more difficult to mandate qualifications in certain apprenticeships now. And what ESFA are saying is that non-mandatory qualifications, obviously you will not be able to fund them through the levy. So you as an employer would have to contribute commercially to that. But if you were going, if you had been able to deliver the learning through the funding because it mapped to the knowledge, skills and behaviours, you wouldn't be able to deliver additional learning on top of that if somebody has failed or if somebody needs to do a resit. And this is all linked to the rule changes that have coming in with qualifications that I personally do not agree with and lots of employers do not agree with, and we are continuing to have conversations about the need to have qualifications in apprenticeship standards. But what I would say from your point of view as employers is you must have discussions about qualifications, resits, exam costs, resit, any elements up front, because what you don't want to be doing is be stung later on in the programme if a learner does fail an element and you are asked to pay for resits. So it's really important that you're up front, you ask them questions about any commercial fees that might be applicable, and have that all recorded down. You then sign it, you then sort out how you're going to pay for that and how those costs will be taken, whether they'll be taken up front, whether they'll be taken in stages through the programme. And one thing I would say is also have a conversation about what happens if the learner doesn't continue or comes off programme. Would you get a refund? Would you get a rebate if you'd had to pay for it all up front? So just a little bit of something to have a think about in terms of commercial costs. And unfortunately, because providers are under quite a lot of funding pressure at the moment, there are elements that aren't fundable. Funding bans are the government's contribution, as they say in the official guidance for apprenticeships. But you might be having conversations, and they might be awkward conversations with providers that they can't facilitate the full programme with just the levy contributions at the moment due to increased costs and demands internally. So things that may have been funded in the past, or freebies or added value things, they may be incurring costs nowadays so that providers can can break even and pay their staff, etc., etc. So it's just something to bear in mind. Endpoint assessment. So there's a couple of rule changes here around if an apprentice changes employer. So hopefully that won't happen with any of yours. You'll keep your apprentices and they will want to stay. But what they're adding in is some safeguards that if apprentices do change employer after they've completed all of their training, that they could still complete endpoint assessment with an endpoint assessment organisation and a provider that could help and support through that process. There are more rules coming out about it, because obviously it isn't necessarily going to be easy to do that in certain sectors or certain areas. It will be easier in others than different ones, but we are waiting for some more rules on this. But I think what it's saying is, if an apprentice loses their employer, but they have all the training and they have the competence, why should they not be able to complete endpoint assessment? And if something can be put in place to help them finish their apprenticeship, then that, should be looked at, and they are looking at how they can fund this. And there's also a rule around apprenticeships maybe wanting to change the organisation once the assessments have started. And this is potentially a bit of an awkward scenario, whereas you might want to switch endpoint assessment organisation before the end, or once EPA has already started. And what they're saying is that all the employer and the provider obviously need to agree. They then need to engage with a different EPAO who could then take over, and then pricing would need to be negotiated. What I would say in previous experience is have an honest conversation with the endpoint assessment organisation that you're currently engaged with. If there's a complaint, if there's an issue, rather than switching. And the simple reason I say that is because switching a provider halfway through a training plan can be difficult, but having somebody that's already prepared to undertake endpoint assessment under one set of rules and one set of guidance to then switch at the last minute could be quite unsettling for an apprentice and halfway through that process. So I think switching should be the last resort, but it is now something that can be considered if you are having issues, or if learners are not happy with the service or with the assessment that they're having, and you want to look at moving them, then it is now a rule that can be looked at. Pricing, I've already mentioned it, but I put it on a slide about fundable costs. So the maximum funding band is the band that is allocated at the beginning of the apprenticeship. Any savings from recognised prior learning must come from the funding band, not any cost that you might be charged. So maximum funding band minus any prior learning, and then any commercial costs will then be paid separately and need to be agreed and costed accordingly with you as employers. And then final sections around break-in learning. So again, break-in learning is if a learner needs to, as it says on the tin, if a learner wants to take a break from their apprenticeship, or where there is no planned active learning taking place, the rule is being moved to a calendar month again, rather than a 28-day 4-week rule. And again, this is just bringing in some timescale consistencies. Break-in learnings are there to be used. They're not just to be there to be used if somebody can't be bothered anymore. If there is a valid reason, if there's an extended break, if there's something going on in somebody's individual personal life that is meaning that the training plan will not be met to, then obviously that deems a conversation with the training provider. Breaks in learning shouldn't be used for those that really don't want to carry on anymore. Break-in learning should not be dragged out, and there should always be a planned return date if somebody is going on to a break-in learning. So these are the type of questions that providers might challenge back to employers if you are asking for somebody to go on a break-in learning. And then just some support, financial support that may be available to you, or is available to you. There is still the £1,000 additional payment for employers taking on apprentices 16 to 18 or 19 to 24 who had or has an educational healthcare plan. That will continue. And I mentioned at the beginning, there is a care leaver bursary that kicks in from the 1st of August, which will be an increase from 1,000 to 3,000. And then if you are an employer that takes on, that has less than 50 in your workforce, then government funding, the funding band will be fully covered. If you are a levy payer, then you have your levy. If you run out of levy, you then go on to 95% funding, where you contribute 5%. And if you are a non-levy payer, then you have your 95% of funding paid for. What I would say is if the total cost is above that funding, you will be asked to contribute on top of that. So obviously the conversations that we've had about qualifications, that added value content, all of this would potentially be outside of levy or 95% funding rules. So that brings me to the end of the update. There is a couple of outstanding queries still. There is a rule change around who is responsible for selecting the endpoint assessment organisation. This is rule 100 in the funding rules. We are waiting for further guidance. I did check yesterday to see if it had come out before today, but it hasn't yet. So there are, moving from the 1st of August, providers will be allowed to choose the endpoint assessment organisation, which is a shift from an employer-led decision. What I would say is if you are happy as an employer with the endpoint assessment organisations that you're currently working with, you don't have to move. You need to be honest and upfront and quite strict with your providers into who, and it should still be your choice. Although I do understand that a lot of providers do have preferred partners that they work with, and if they work fine, then that's, that's okay. But obviously stay in control, make sure you understand the choice that is there for you for EPA, and that you're involved in the conversations. And also changes of employment after gateway, and if there's a change of circumstances, we are still waiting for some funding rules around if people are moving placements, if they're moving company and there's a change of circumstances, and we still haven't had those rule changes yet. Again, I've chased the ESFA, but they just said in due course. So we will keep you in the loop with that. Funding rules are obviously on the system in full detail. There is a summary of changes through the link as well, which highlight the key changes through the year. I hope I've covered all the main takeouts that there is, but obviously if you're the levy lead, if you're the lead internally, have a look through the documentation and obviously make sure you're engaging in your conversations with your training providers, especially if you're using different training providers, because they do all have different templates for paperwork. They might have a different approach to how they adopt the training plan development. So it's about early engagement and making sure you're allocating enough time to ensure that the training plans are developed properly. And there's just my details at the end. If anybody wants to pick up anything with me individually, anyone's got any questions or they want some help and support, please feel free to get in touch. Either give me a call or drop me an email, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel. Cheers for that. I appreciate there's a lot to go through there. Just a couple of questions that have come in via the chat, really, which we hope we can pick up at the end. Someone's asking if this is the only set of funding rule changes for the year, or if there's more planned.
So there's always a version 1 that comes out at the beginning of the year, and there is potential to change rules through the year. On average, we have probably 2 updates throughout the academic year. We'll definitely have an update when they make their mind up about the EPA, who selects the endpoint assessment organisation, and then during the academic year, if there is queries during audits or if there are wording changes that need, they will do an update. What I tend to do is if there is a funding rule update for SIP members, you will get an e-alert and there'll be a reference in newsletters. If people aren't in the SIP but attend SI8 meetings, then we sometimes cover it there. But if not, there is published guidance on the link that we sent you, and the latest version will always supersede the old version, and they'll always come out with a summary of change as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. Hopefully that answers that question. And someone's asking, how do we keep track of off-the-job training as an employer?
So through the training plan, each module, each outcome, so KSBs or linked to themes, will have an allocated amount of hours that need to be met. Attending classes, there should be registers, and normally through modern day e-portfolio systems, there is a trackable link to when off the job is planned and then when off the job happens, and that should be tallied up and should be reflected and reviewed at each progress review. You internally, if you're delivering your own training, which you have agreed to be off the job, then you can also track. The learner can normally, again, using an e-portfolio system, but also good old paper doesn't do any harm, can keep a trackable log, which can be the learner's responsibility to update. And it is really important that they are updating their off-the-job logs, that they're completing their reflective statements. And it does help when you're starting to prepare for endpoint assessment if you have got into a good position of reflective practice throughout the apprenticeship programme.
Excellent. Thanks again, Rachel, for that. So yeah, just a reminder, Ruth, at the start, but a copy of the slides will be sent out to everyone who registered for today's session, and along with a copy of the recording as well. Thanks again, Rachel, for your time. Hopefully you found that really useful for those people who attended. And let's just have a good afternoon, folks. Brilliant. Cheers all.